"You're not welcome here, Dad. Not tonight. Not ever." Ethan's voice didn't just cut through the hum of the Christmas Eve dinner, it shattered it. The sound ricocheted off the vaulted ceilings, silencing clinking glasses and freezing forks midair. Every face around the long mahogany table turned toward us, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and morbid curiosity. Madison, poised beside him like a queen on her throne, let her manicured fingers curl possessively around his arm. Her lips twitched upward in a smile so venomous it was meant only for me. My chest tightened. "What did you just say to me?" I stepped forward into the golden light flooding their Westlake Hills mansion, each step fueled by disbelief and rising heat in my veins. "You heard me." Ethan's reply was sharp, each word dipped in contempt. "Richard Pierce is the kind of man I call family successful, respected, someone worth introducing to people who matter. You?" His eyes swept over me, slow and deliberate. "You're just a worn-out builder in a suit that screams thrift store." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the guests. Madison tilted her head toward him, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the table. "It's almost poetic, Ethan. The contrast tonight. It's perfect." My fists curled tight enough to hurt. 45 years, I said, my voice rising, of building homes with my bare hands, breaking my back so you could have the education you flaunt like a trophy. And this is the thanks I get? You think a man's worth can be measured in square footage and bank statements? Ethan laughed, low and humorless. "You've been an anchor around my neck since the day I graduated. Madison's family, they showed me what real opportunity looks like. I stared at him, at my own son, searching for the boy who once beamed with pride, telling his friends his dad could fix anything. All I saw was a stranger wearing his face. "If you truly believe you're too good for me," I said, my voice cutting through the room's suffocating tension, "then let's see how far you get without me." Gasps erupted. Ethan smirked. Madison's eyes glittered with something close to triumph. They thought they'd just stripped me of my dignity. They didn't realize they'd just lit the fuse to something far more dangerous. If this story touched your heart, press 1" the comments. If you think it could have been handled differently, press 2. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Westlake Hills, Austin isn't the kind of place you wander into by mistake. The drive up is a parade of gated estates with imported stone facades and landscaping so manicured it looks like the shrubs have personal stylists. Madison grew up here, in a world where holiday parties came with private chefs, $300 bottles of wine flown in from Europe, and guests who treated wealth like it was an inherited birthright. I, Frank Lawson, came from a different world entirely. 45 years swinging hammers and running a modest construction business taught me how to read a blueprint without blinking, pour a foundation to the millimeter, and work a 16-hour day without once checking the clock. My late wife, Laura, used to tease that I carried the smell of sawdust in my skin, a scent, she said, that was proof of the life we'd built together from nothing. When Ethan was a boy, he'd sit on my workbench, legs swinging, sawdust clinging to his socks. "My dad can build anything," he'd tell his friends, his face glowing with pride. Back then, my tools were treasure chests, and he thought I was the luckiest man alive to own them. Then Madison arrived. Beautiful, magnetic, accustomed to getting her way with a smile and a tilt of her head. Her father, Richard Pierce, wasn't just wealthy, he defined wealth. The man owned entire blocks of commercial real estate in Austin. And to his credit, Richard treated me with the polite nod a king might give a hard-working peasant who'd earned his supper. Ethan changed almost overnight. The jeans and work boots were replaced by Italian leather loafers. The words that once spilled out of him, baseball scores, jokes from the job site, were replaced with phrases like portfolio diversification and equity leverage. His laugh became quieter around me, his gaze sharper, like he was calculating what I was worth in dollars and cents. Dinner invitations came less often. Phone calls became a formality. And when we did meet, it was as if there was glass between us, clear enough to see each other, thick enough to muffle anything real. I told myself it was normal. People grow, marriage shifts priorities. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just growth, it was drift. Madison didn't just polish his edges, she rewired the way he valued people. And somewhere in that rewiring, I was downgraded. The last Christmas we shared before tonight, he'd shown up late, stepping into my modest living room in a designer suit that probably cost more than my truck's down payment. He handed me a watch, the very same one I'd been saving to buy him for months without even removing the price tag. Then, as I tried to thank him, he launched into a lecture about the tax benefits of charitable donations, quoting Richard, as though his father's hard-earned lessons meant nothing compared to the gospel according to Madison's family. Still, I clung to the good memories, the baseball practices, the nights I stayed up sanding floorboards so his tuition check wouldn't bounce, the way he once hugged me after I surprised him at his college dorm. I thought those things counted. I thought they were carved in stone. Until tonight. Tonight, I walked into his glittering home, surrounded by guests who glanced at my suit like it was a punchline. And my son, my own flesh and blood, looked me dead in the eye, in front of them all, and told me I didn't belong. The dining room had dropped into that brittle half-silence people put on when they want to appear polite, forks held midair, wine glasses frozen, conversations stopped mid-word, but no one was fooled. Every single ear in that room was tuned to us. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't even glance away. His jaw was locked tight, his hand hooked possessively over the back of Madison's chair, like he was staking a claim. "I didn't come here to fight," I said, though the heat climbing my throat made the words shake. "It's Christmas Eve." "Exactly." Madison purred, her voice sugar, sweet and venom, tipped. "Which is why you should be with people who appreciate you." She tilted her head toward the front door like she was offering me an exit. "We've got tonight under control." My gaze swept the table. Armani suits, Rolexes, diamonds catching the glare from the chandelier. I recognized more than a few faces Richard Pierce's business cronies, the kind of men whose names were bolted in steel to the top of downtown high-rises. This wasn't family dinner. It was a boardroom with candlelight. Ethan leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to force me to lean closer. "Dad, you've got to stop showing up here looking like you just walked off a job site. It's embarrassing." Something inside me snapped. "Embarrassing?" I repeated, my voice climbing like a warning siren. 45 years of honest work is embarrassing to you. You've been stuck in the same mindset since the 82nd, he fired back. Scraping by, settling for small. Richard's taught me how to think bigger, how to be bigger. You wouldn't understand. "Oh, I understand plenty," I said, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I understand that you had the luxury of college because I worked 18-hour days for 3 years straight. I understand I missed your mother's last Thanksgiving because I was pouring concrete in the snow so your tuition check wouldn't bounce. I understand that every dollar you started with came from my so-called small mindset." Ethan's mouth twisted into that smug half-smile I'd seen creeping in over the years. "College didn't pay off until I married Madison. She gave me access to real opportunities. You never could." The air between us felt electric, charged with something ugly. I stared at him, at this man wearing my last name like it was a label he was ready to peel off and replace. The table had gone silent, guests openly staring now. The only sounds the faint hum of the heating vents and the soft clink of crystal against polished wood. "Get out," I said finally, my voice low but lethal, finger aimed toward the front door. Gasps fluttered around the room. Madison let out a delighted little laugh, the kind people give when they've just won a bet. "Oh, please," Ethan scoffed, pushing back his chair so hard it scraped the hardwood. "We both know I've outgrown this place and you." The words hit like cold steel. He strode toward the door, each click of his Italian leather soles on the floor sounding like a countdown. Madison trailed behind, her perfume a final insult in the air between us. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the ornaments on the massive Christmas tree. For a long moment, I just stood there, breathing in the heavy, judgmental silence they'd left behind. By the time I got home, the December wind had emptied the streets. I hung my jacket on the same hook I'd used for 30 years and sank into my old leather chair. The small tear in the armrest Ethan's doing at age 5 caught my eye. I'd always thought I'd patch it someday. Now, I wasn't sure I wanted to. I tried for normal coffee, the crossword, but my thoughts kept circling back to a faint metallic scraping I'd heard as I was leaving Ethan's driveway. The answer came with morning. Snow crunched under my boots as I stepped out to get the mail. The drifts in front of the box were stamped with fresh size 10 or 11 prints. The mailbox itself hung crooked, the metal door bent inward, deep scratches gleaming under the weak winter sun. This wasn't kids fooling around. This was a message. Standing there in the cold, my breath steaming in the air, I read it loud and clear. "You don't belong here. Don't come back." Inside, the coffee tasted like ash. I told myself it could have been random vandalism, but deep down, I knew exactly whose shadow was behind it. At 9 o'clock sharp, the phone rang. Ethan's number lit up the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Dad?" he said warmly, too warmly. "About last night, I overreacted. I'm sorry." A chill spread through me. The Ethan I'd seen in that dining room had been cruel, but at least he'd been honest. This voice? This was polished, scripted. "Madison and I talked," he continued, "and we'd really love for you to come to Christmas dinner tonight. Richard will be there. His business partners, too. It'll be nice." My gut twisted. Why the sudden change of heart? He chuckled, light and practiced. "Because it's Christmas, and because first impressions matter, especially with Richard's associates. Wear that suit from Mom's funeral. It's dignified." In the background, muffled but unmistakable, Madison's voice cut through. "He'll come. Did you hear that pathetic hope? This is going to be perfect." The line went quiet. My hands were trembling when I set the phone down. Whatever last night had been, this was something far darker. I sat at the kitchen table long after the call ended, my coffee cold and undrinkable, Madison's muffled voice looping in my head like a taunt I couldn't shut off. Pathetic hope. This is going to be perfect. It wasn't just the sudden change in tone. It wasn't just the hollow apology. It was the precision, the clean, deliberate way each moment lined up. Last night's public humiliation, the vandalized mailbox at dawn, and now this invitation, all of it clicking together like the teeth of a gear turning toward one purpose. This wasn't reconciliation, this was choreography. A stage was being built, and they expected me to stand under the spotlight as the willing fool. I pushed back from the table and crossed to the small desk tucked in the corner of my living room where I kept the documents that mattered: contracts, insurance policies, business records. My hand hovered over a stack of business cards collected over the years. One in particular caught my eye, thick cardstock, gold embossing that caught the light. Richard Pierce, Pierce Commercial Group, President and CEO, Direct Office, 512. "Call any time, Frank. We should get to know each other better." I remembered the night he'd handed it to me, 2 years back at Ethan's birthday dinner. His handshake had been firm, his gaze level, without the faintest trace of the condescension Madison wore like perfume. He'd struck me as a man who valued truth over theatrics. If Madison and Ethan thought they could use me as a prop to sell him some warped idea of success, then he deserved the truth without begging, without self-pity, without theatrics of my own. Just the facts. Cold. Unmistakable. I pulled a yellow legal pad toward me and started jotting. Last night's confrontation. The mailbox. The phone call. Madison's exact words. Their likely intent to impress him, secure his endorsement, and humiliate me in the process. I practiced the delivery in my head. "Richard, I know this isn't a comfortable call, but you should know what's being set up for tonight." I overheard them. "This isn't a family dinner, it's a performance, and you're the audience they're trying to manipulate." The risk wasn't lost on me. If Richard was more like Madison than I'd thought, he'd dismiss me, or worse, tip them off. But my gut said otherwise. The man had clawed his way to the top of Texas real estate. That's a place where lies rot quickly, and people who peddle them are cut loose without ceremony. I picked up my phone, thumb hovering over the keypad, then set it down again. Timing mattered. If Madison was in his office, the warning would never make it past her smile. I needed a moment when I knew he'd be alone. The kitchen clock read 9:07 a.m. On Christmas Eve, a man like Richard would be clearing the last urgent items from his desk before heading home to whatever palatial spread he called a living room. He dialed. 2 rings. Richard Pierce. His voice was sharp, unhurried, the tone of someone already in control of his day. "Richard, it's Frank Lawson. I'm calling about tonight's dinner," I said. In under 3 minutes, I laid everything out: the dining room ambush, the vandalism in the snow, the phone call, Madison's laugh. No embellishment, no heat, just the truth, hammered straight. Silence stretched for a beat, then a slow, contained exhale. "Frank, I believe you, and I don't take kindly to being made a pawn in someone else's petty power play." "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I'll handle my end," he said, "but you'd better be ready for yours." I looked toward the grocery bags I'd dropped on the counter last night: turkey, vegetables, pies. I'd planned a quiet holiday meal for one. But now, the thought shifted into something sharper, a plan forming like a structure taking shape on blueprints. "I'll be ready," I told him. The rest of the morning moved with a calm I hadn't felt in days, the kind of stillness that settles over you when the plan finally snaps into place and every piece feels inevitable. I started in the kitchen, unpacking the bags from the night before: fresh green beans, a 20-pound turkey, Yukon Gold potatoes, 2 pies still warm from the bakery. Yesterday, they were just ingredients for a solitary meal. Today, they were the foundation for something far bigger, something that would turn their carefully staged dinner into ashes. By noon, the turkey was roasting, the skin basting in a blend of butter, sage, and garlic. The smell wound its way through the house, rich and grounding. Cranberries bubbled on the stove, tart and sweet at once, the scent pulling up a memory of Laura humming to herself as she stirred a pot on Christmas Eve years ago. I set the table with the good china white plates edged in silver, a gift from my mother that we'd reserved for holidays. Ethan used to fight for the one with the most perfect snowflake pattern in the center, his little hands barely able to carry it to the table. I ran my finger over the design now, a reminder that this was about more than food. This was about building something real, something worth walking away from their hollow performance for. If Richard's end of the plan worked, my home needed to be ready to receive guests, his guests. The kind of people accustomed to catered menus and imported vintages, walking into a working-class living room with framed family photos on the wall and scuffs in the hardwood from years of living. By sundown, I was in my dark blue suit, the one from Laura's funeral. Pressed, clean, tie straight, boots polished until they caught the light. I didn't look like a man arriving to beg my way into anyone's good graces. I looked like a man who could stand in any room and not flinch. The drive to Westlake Hills was like crossing a border into another country. Mansions sat behind wrought iron gates, names etched in brass like they were brands. Ethan and Madison's house glowed in the winter dusk spotlights on the limestone facade, wreaths on every door, professionally dressed Christmas trees in every front window. I parked my old Silverado between a Porsche and a Tesla. The contrast was so stark it almost made me laugh. Taking the stone path to the door, I caught the faint hum of conversation inside, like the prelude to a play about to start. The door swung open before I could knock. Ethan stood there in a tailored black tux, the picture of precision. Madison drifted into view behind him, a champagne flute in hand, her smile honed to a blade. "Well, well," Ethan said, loud enough to draw every eye in the room. "Look who decided to show up." Madison's gaze raked over me. "Oh, Frank, you actually wore the funeral tie. How quaint." I stepped inside, scanning the room. Richard at the far end of the table, flanked by his partners, the candlelight gleaming off crystal stemware. Every guest looked up, sizing me up with polite, detached curiosity. Ethan leaned close, voice low but laced with warning. "Remember, you're here to be civil. Don't embarrass yourself." I didn't bother to answer. The script they'd written for tonight was already in flames. They just didn't know it yet. Dinner started with the kind of small talk that sounds like conversation but is really just people waiting for their turn to speak. Madison poured wine and laughed too loudly, steering the focus toward Ethan's connections and projects. He dropped names like breadcrumbs, each one leading back to Richard. Then, halfway through the first course, Richard set down his fork. "I'd like to say a few words," he announced, his voice calm but carrying easily over the table. Madison's face lit up, and Ethan leaned back in his chair, certain this was the moment Richard would crown them the heirs to his circle. But I saw the steel in his eyes. Richard's gaze swept the table, finally fixing on the two of them. This week taught me the difference between building yourself up and tearing someone else down to do it. The air shifted. Forks froze. Ethan's smile faltered. Madison's fingers tightened on her glass. "I won't sit at a table where cruelty is dressed as ambition," Richard continued. "So tonight I'm choosing to spend Christmas Eve somewhere else. Somewhere I'm reminded of what real family looks like." He stood. The silence cracked. Chairs slid back, and one by one every guest followed. The scrape of Richard's chair against the polished hardwood sounded like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. His words had dropped into the room like a lead weight, and the shock waves hit every face around the table, mouths tightening, eyes flicking between him and Ethan like they were watching a slow-motion collapse. "Richard, wait!" Ethan blurted, springing to his feet so fast his napkin slid to the floor. "You're misunderstanding." Richard didn't so much as cut his gaze in his direction. "No misunderstanding," he said, voice even but final. "I've seen enough." Madison's tone pitched high, a sharp edge of panic threading through it. "Daddy, please don't make a scene." "I'm not making a scene," Richard cut her off. "I'm making a choice, and so is everyone else here." Something shifted like a fuse burning down to the last spark. One of Richard's oldest business partners cleared his throat, stood, and offered Ethan a polite nod that carried the sting of dismissal. Richard's right. Family gatherings aren't for public humiliation. Another man stood without a word. Then a woman across the table followed, collecting her coat. Polite murmurs of goodbye floated through the air, but they carried a judgment no one could miss. Madison's smile was breaking, her eyes darting from one retreating guest to another. "You don't have to leave. This is all a misunderstanding." But the tide was moving. Richard's quiet authority had pulled the current, and no one was swimming against it. The most powerful man in the room had turned his back, and the rest followed. I stayed seated, watching the unraveling with a strange, steady calm. It was like watching a building get dismantled beam by beam, until only the empty shell remained. Ethan's voice cracked with desperation. "Where are you going? This was supposed to be—" "A celebration," one departing guest said over his shoulder. "It stopped being that the second you turned your father into a prop." Richard was the last to reach the door, his coat already on. He paused by my chair, his hand resting firmly on my shoulder. "Frank," he said, his voice low enough for only me to hear, "I believe you have a better place for us to spend the evening." "I do," I said, rising to my feet. Ethan's eyes went wide, realization hitting like a slap. You planned this." Richard's gaze locked on him, cold and unblinking. "No, Ethan, you did. You just didn't understand what you were planning for." Madison's glass rattled against the table, champagne sloshing over the rim. "Daddy!" But Richard was already gone, stepping into the sharp December air. I followed, and behind us came the others. Mercedes, Bentleys, and BMWs lining up behind my old Silverado like an improbable convoy. From the doorway, Ethan's voice chased after me, raw and sharp. "This isn't over!" I didn't turn, because for him, it already was. The drive back to my neighborhood took less than 15 minutes, but it felt like crossing continents. Behind me, a line of luxury cars glided through the quiet streets in perfect formation, their headlights slicing through the cold Texas night. I pulled into my modest driveway, Christmas lights blinking gently against weathered siding. The convoy settled along the curb, looking so out of place it was almost surreal. Across the street, Mrs. Collier's curtain twitched, no doubt wondering if I'd hit the Powerball or somehow landed a seat on the city council. I opened my front door, warm light spilling across the porch. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. They entered cautiously, taking in the small but carefully tended living room. In the corner stood the Christmas tree, its ornaments not selected for style, but for memory. Laura's delicate glass angel. Ethan's popsicle stick star from first grade. The set of red bells we'd bought our first Christmas as husband and wife. The dining table was set for 8, the air thick with the scent of sage-roasted turkey, buttery mashed potatoes, and cinnamon apple pie. Richard's gaze lingered on the table. "You did all this yourself?" "Started at noon," I said. Figured it was worth doing right. Within minutes, coats were hung, glasses filled, and conversation flowed. This wasn't the stiff, posturing small talk from Ethan's dining room. It was warm, unguarded. Guests shared childhood stories, confessed humble beginnings, and more than one admitted they'd been raised by fathers who worked with their hands. Halfway through the meal, Richard raised his glass. "To Frank for reminding us what Christmas is supposed to feel like." The clink of glassware rang soft but certain. Heat spread through the room that had nothing to do with the vent by the window. Then the front door slammed open. Ethan strode in, Madison close behind. Both were still in their evening wear, though Madison's lipstick was smeared and her hair slightly undone. "How dare you?" Ethan's voice cracked with fury. "You stole our guests." The room froze. Richard set his glass down with deliberate calm. "No," I said evenly. "I invited them somewhere they'd be welcome. You turned them against us." Madison's voice was sharp, her finger stabbing at me. "You told some sob story to make us look bad." One of Richard's partners spoke before I could. "You didn't need any help with that. Your father's hospitality speaks for itself. Ethan's voice rose. He's just bitter because I've moved beyond his small life. Richard's eyes hardened. Small life? You mean the life that put you through college? The man who skipped his own holidays to pay your tuition? Ethan flushed. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, Richard cut in, his voice turning to steel. You tried to humiliate your father to make yourself look bigger in my eyes. Instead, you've made yourself look like a child playing at power. Madison stepped forward, her voice trembling. Daddy, we were trying to show you— What you've shown me, Richard said, is that neither of you can be trusted with my business or my name. He fixed Ethan with a cold stare. Effective immediately. You're out of every Pierce commercial project. And Madison, your inheritance will reflect exactly the character you've displayed tonight. The silence after was suffocating. Ethan's fists clenched. You can't do this. I just did, Richard replied. I rose from my chair, meeting my son's eyes. I wish it hadn't come to this, but you made your choice when you turned my love into a tool. Ethan's voice broke. You ruined everything. No, I said quietly. You did that yourself. Madison gripped his arm. Let's go. They left without another word, the door shutting behind them with a heavy finality. Richard lifted his glass once more. To family the kind we choose, not just the kind we're born into. And we drank to that. Snow had started while we were eating thin, deliberate flakes drifting into the quiet street, catching in the warm halo of the porch light. By the time dessert was finished, the outside world looked transformed, the raw edges of the night softened under a clean, white layer. It was as if even the weather had decided to seal off what had happened, covering the tracks behind us. Richard leaned back in his chair, the sharpness in his eyes replaced by a calm weight. Frank, he said, his voice lower now, I owe you more than an apology. You didn't just warn me, you reminded me of something I'd begun to forget. Character outlasts pedigree. It's worth more than money, more than any deal I've ever signed. I shook my head. You don't owe me anything. Sometimes we just need someone to hold up a mirror. A slow smile crept across his face. Then I'm glad you were the one holding it tonight. Around the table, heads nodded. These were people who had weathered enough ambition, enough betrayal to recognize the difference between posturing and authenticity. They knew the rare weight of someone who chose to stand their ground. One of Richard's partners lifted his glass. To second chances and to the people who've earned them. We drank, and I felt something shift, not triumph, not even pride, but a deep, steady relief. Relief that I hadn't let their game write my story. Relief that I'd stood my ground without having to trade integrity for a victory. When the night finally wound down, the last guests left with handshakes that lingered and smiles that didn't need rehearsing. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the snow drift down over the faint trail of footprints in my yard. The air bit cold at my cheeks, but the stillness felt clean. True, Laura used to say Christmas had nothing to do with the perfect tree or the polished table. It was about who showed up when it mattered. Tonight had proved her right. I closed the door, the glow from the tree spilling across the living room in soft gold light. For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel empty. It felt full of something far better than noise. Family, the kind you can trust,